Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about depth of field. We saw in the previous video, right, that with depth of field we can put emphasis on a specific subject and have a blurry background, blurry foreground, so the eye goes right away into that subject that you want to deliver a message with or something. On the other side, we can have really big depth of field, meaning that we can have a lot of details in both foreground and background, right? And also we saw that depth of field, actually aperture is a tool that we can use to maximize the sharpness of our images. So what is depth of field? So in photography we have three planes. We have, if I take a camera, so we have the film plane, which is identified by this symbol right here. And this is where the film is or the sensor is, right? The second plane is the optical plane. So it's another plane that is parallel to the first plane, which is somewhere in the lens. And third, we have the focus plane. So this is where we are focusing to, right? So this plane is really sharp. So everything on that plane has the maximum sharpness. And when we go out of that plane, then it gets more and more blurry, right? So depth of field is a zone in which we considered that the objects are in focus, right? So I will repeat. So we have the first plane, which is the film plane or sensor plane, the optical plane, and the focus plane. Now, when we make the focus on a subject, there is a certain zone in which we considered the objects are in focus. In front of that and in back of that zone, it's considered to be blurry, right? So we have three things that control depth of fields, right? So there are three ways to control depth of field. Obviously, the first one is, you guessed it, aperture, right? So I'm going to show you a few examples of photo. So if we have a big aperture, so the bigger our aperture is and the shallower the depth of field will be, right? On the contrary, if we stop down our lens, if we have a smaller aperture, then the depth of field will grow bigger and bigger to the point that at some point it will be infinite. So we'll see that in a few minutes. All right, this is the first criteria, the first factor that helps us control the depth of field, the aperture. Second is focal length. So if we use a really small focal length, let's say a wide angle or even a fisheye, then we will have really big depth of field, right? And on the contrary, if we use a teleobjective, so the longer our focal length is, then the shallower our depth of field will be, right? And third, the distance. So the distance between the film plane and the focus plane. So basically the distance between the photographer and the subject. All right, so that is our third factor to control the depth of field. So the closer we are to a subject, and then the shallower the depth of field is. Think about a photo of a flower or something macro. Then you see one detail really sharp, and right next to it, it's already blurry, right? The depth of field are really small, right? And on the contrary, if our subject is really far away, then we have a really big depth of field, even infinite. Think about it, right? So if we take a mountain, we have the moon and the stars, they're all in focus. that's really big, right? Millions of kilometers, even light years, right? So some people might say that sensor size is another factor to control depth of field. You know, bigger sensor size gives better depth of field. No, this is not a factor. Maybe indirectly, I will explain, but this is not a factor to control the depth of field. So what happens if, let's say I have, for comparison, I have a cell phone and I have this, this is an APS-C sensor size. So to have the same perspective, this lens and that lens, sorry, here, are not exactly the same, right? Much different. To have the same perspective, the same angle of view, this is a 35, this will be, I don't know, 4 millimeter. So what is changing here? The sensor size? Yeah, it's changing, but to have the same perspective, you change what? The focal length. This is what is changing. So by changing the focal length, we change the depth of field in a big way, all right? So it's not sensor size, it's one of the first three, which is focal length, all right? There's a compensation you can do if, for example, you do a picture of a bottle. If you do tabletop or even studio, it's interesting, right? If you have, let's say, for example, if you're using a wide angle, this is not a wide angle, but it doesn't matter. So let's say you use a wide angle to take a picture of a bottle, okay? So you have a certain distance, you're at a certain distance, you have a certain frame, okay? And you have, let's say you use at f4 and you have, let's say 12 inch of depth of field, all right? Let's say you're happy with that, but the perspective is not great, okay? So you remove the lens and instead of putting a wide angle, you put a telephoto on it. And okay, now you have to step back, right? You have to be far away, and then you frame the exact same frame, okay? What will be the depth of field? Same aperture, different distance, different focal, same frame. And we had 12 inch. Well, we will have about 12 inch, you know, really close to it, depending on the optical formulas. And so what happened? Okay, so you had f4 with the two lens, so aperture doesn't change. What does change though is the focal length. First thing we do is we change the focal length. Instead of putting a wide angle, we put a telephoto. So what happens with depth of field? If we change the focal length for a bigger one, obviously it comes much smaller. So instead of having 12 inch, maybe we have 1 inch, I don't know. But what do? We get back, right? We go back. So the distance, we increase it. The distance between the film plane and the focal plane is much bigger now. And magically, if we go to the same exact frame, we will have the same exact depth of field. Cool? That's a little trick. All right. If you want to know before buying a lens, what will be the depth of field you will have with your lens you want to buy, I suggest you go to DOF Master, so that's DOFMaster.com, or any other places on the web. You can even download some apps for your phone, whether it's one company or the other one. So there's a lot of applications that can give you estimations or calculations of your depth of field and hyperfocal distance, which will be needed for our next video. All right? I hope you found that useful. So depth of field, how to control it, what can we do with it. If you want to see examples of how to be creative with it, I implore you to go see my previous video about the 3 exposure parameters. Really great tricks will be in the next video with hyperfocals. Hyperfocals will open a lot of tools for photographers to do all sorts of things, because with hyperfocals, photographers don't need to do the focus anymore. That's going to be really interesting. All right, so until then, thanks very much for watching. Please subscribe, comment, and may the photo be with you.